Today's video is about how I believe Luffy's encounter with the Cypher Pull agents, and most specifically Rob Lucci, inspired not only Gear 2nd and 3rd, but 4th and 5th as well. Now, if you follow my channel, you might have been expecting this video to be more about Rob Lucci, why he awakened his Devil Fruit, and why Kaido seemingly didn't awaken his Devil Fruit. Well, that video is still in the works. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it out today because I just keep on adding more and more detail into it. So it's just turning out to be an even better video than expected, but we gotta wait longer. Anyway, today's video is actually about a topic I introduced over 2 years ago in my video, Why Roku Shiki is and Always Has Been Haki, in which I go to show how the abilities Luffy uses in Gear 4 that are armament related are eerily similar to Roku Shiki, and how that connection is proof that goes to show that Roku Shiki and Haki are one and the same. I even went as far as to suggest that perhaps Luffy watching Lucci change forms throughout battle is what inspired him eventually down the line to create Gear 4. Now, this theory is great and all, but I'm not here to rehash a theory that's already on my channel. What I wanted to show you is a theory that I actually uploaded to Reddit and never brought to this channel. The reason being because despite that theory being posted 9 months ago, it's more relevant now than ever. Essentially, that post was about how I believed the concept of life return and Roku Shiki is what helped Luffy to awaken his Devil Fruit. So first, I'll show you a clip from Roku Shiki is and Always Has Been Haki, just so you can get the gist of all of the moments where you can see Roku Shiki in Luffy's gears. And I'll explain the relevance of that a little bit later. Then, once I'm done showing you that clip, I will move on to the Reddit post, read that, and then, as I'm going along, giving you my updated take on that theory and how that relates to the most recent chapters. To start off this theory, let's address a blaringly obvious concern with CP9 and Haki. Why would the world government train elite warriors from childhood and not teach them Haki? Well, according to my theory, the answer to this is that they were teaching them Haki. It just wasn't under the name Haki. Off the first impression, it would seem that Haki and Roku Shiki are not related. Haki is based on spiritual powers, and Roku Shiki is about maximizing a human's physical capability. However, when you really look at what Roku Shiki is capable of accomplishing, you'd realize that there are supernatural elements to it that go way beyond the suspense of disbelief. For example, those that master Kamiye are capable of freely moving their body as if they were as malleable as Play-Doh. Not even a rubber man like Luffy can do that under normal conditions. This changed for Luffy when he learned Haki. In order for Luffy to use Gear 4, he must have Haki. The question is why? Well, it's because Armament Haki does more than just make Luffy's skin harder, which is similar to Tekai. It allows him to freely move his body, like with Kamiye, and fly, like with Geppo. Basically, how I see Roku Shiki is that it is like an incomplete version of Haki, which is something that already occurs in One Piece. Mantra is a concept that focuses just on observation Haki. However, the two are considered the same thing despite Mantra not covering all the bases that Haki does. Alright, before we start reading this Reddit, I want to preface by saying the very thing that spawned me to make this theory isn't even mentioned in the theory. This is because I wanted to make a post that was anime only friendly. Yet even now, 9 months later, they would still be spoiled because it hasn't been shown in the anime yet. What I'm referring to is when Gear 4th Snake Man Luffy was using Culverine against Kaido. Kaido made a comment about how it didn't make sense the way his arms would bend and have a trajectory that they have even for a rubber man. Another thing I want to address is why even bring up Gear 4th? Like, sure, there could be a theory there, but we're moving on to Gear 5th and Awakenings. Well, I do think Gear 4th is still relevant to the topic of Awakenings, because just look at the way Gear 4th is designed and compare it to Gear 5th. Like, it can't be a coincidence that his Gear 4th has fiery hair, has flame patterns, has that same sash of steam around. One could wonder, could Gear 4th be a hybrid Maybe. I don't necessarily think that, but I have heard people speculate that. But one thing's for certain, it draws a comparison between Luffy and Lucci, because even without Gear 5th, you would still look at Lucci and think, isn't that similar to Gear 4th? Because the sash is just there and it just can't be anything random. Like, there's not a lot of coincidences in One Piece. Oda is a very thorough writer. Enough of that. The theory will talk for itself and will explain the relevance of Gear 4th. So let's begin. Why Luffy can bend his arm like that, even as a rubber man, right? So with the first panel, we see Luffy say, "Keep chasing him, Python." That's a very notable thing that I'll bring up later. And you can see Doflamingo is just like, why? This time he's not shrinking. It's very odd that his arm keeps stretching and expanding. That's also very important. Keep that in mind. So this time I show what he used against Katakuri, which was Snake Man. And if you notice, each time his arm turns, there's like a air blast associated with the turning of his arm. And once again, he's saying, "After him, Python." It's like he's speaking to his own arm. So I write, "We have seen Culverin used in Bound Man and much more in Snake Man. The Gomu Gomu no Mi may be able to grant Luffy the ability to stretch like rubber, but it doesn't explain why his arm can bend. Nor that it doesn't explain why his arm keeps expanding instead of shrinking." So then I show Luffy using Soru and Geppo. The reason being is I just want to show, hey, it's not as if devil fruits are the only abilities that can be used by people, right? So Luffy can use other abilities that don't necessarily have to derive from his rubber powers. So I write, "One thing not to forget is that there are other abilities in One Piece besides devil fruit. One in particular is Roku Shiki, which is an ability that Luffy has emulated on more than one occasion. Sometimes it's been noted and obvious when Luffy copied Roku Shiki, like the time he's fighting Blue Note, and he just literally goes, oh wow, he's using one of our techniques. However, there's been other times that were subtle and not really pointed out. For example, Luffy used a move that is pretty much the same one that Kaku used. So I ask, is Kaku rubber? Obviously not. We shouldn't be so surprised when Luffy does something as simple as bend his arm. The ability that Luffy could be emulating to use Culverin may not actually be one of the 6 powers, but rather an ability related to Roku Shiki. This would be Life Return. Now let's read how Life Return is described by Kumodori and Chopper. In nature, from the hair on one's head, from one's vital organs, to the tip of one's toes, even to the ends of one's short hairs, there is not a single spot that cannot be controlled with one's consciousness. So Chopper says, you can consciously control every part of your body, even your hair? I read about something like this in a book. It's called biofeedback or something. I write, while it is true that Luffy hasn't encountered Kumodori, he did witness Lucci use Life Return, and the Boa sisters use a technique that is eerily similar to Life Return. In fact, he may have named Culverin and Snake Man after the Boa sisters. Notice how Lucci chastises Luffy over his lack of control of his own Devil Fruit ability. Then notice immediately after that, he uses Life Return paper art fighting form. It's almost as if he's bragging. He's showing, hey, you have no control over your body. Now look at this. I'm an expert at this. Luffy could have taken this to heart and realized that he too needed to be adaptable in battle. And then add that to the fact that him fighting the Boa sisters is what could have taught him that Life Return is a Haki ability. Thus, he could have made it his mission while learning Haki over the time skip that he would also want to learn Life Return as well. With that in mind, it shouldn't be too surprising that they seem to have similar awakenings, because they probably got there in a similar manner. So I write, I'm suggesting that Luffy could be controlling the bending of his arms with Life Return. However, that doesn't explain why it is However, that doesn't explain why it is that his arm keeps stretching and even accelerates in the case of Snake Man. It's one thing to bend your arm, it's a whole nother thing for the arm to just keep on ramping up speed. That literally goes against the laws of physics, especially when you're talking about rubber. So then I write, what if this has been the result of Luffy using Awakening? It could be the case that Luffy is turning the air into a rubber trampoline for his fist to bounce off of. This would be similar to the quirk of Gentle from My Hero Academia. So I'm essentially suggesting that Luffy has been subconsciously using Awakening this whole time without even realizing it. Back when I wrote this, we didn't know what Gear 5th would look like, or the fact that it was an awakening of a zone that Luffy was unaware of. But now it seems all the more validated that Luffy has been subconsciously using his Awakening because of the fact that Gear 4th already looks similar to Gear 5th. You might be wondering why it is that Life Return would even be relevant if Devil Fruit Awakening alone could produce the results necessary for Culverin to be possible. Well, we must wonder how it is Luffy could have learned to use Awakening in the first place. One thing to consider in hindsight, now that we know of Nika's involvement in Luffy's power, is the fact that maybe the reason his arm bends at a trajectory and picks up speed is because he imagines it to be so, right? He's using the power of imagination to go beyond what's in reality. One way or the other, he's using Awakening, so the point still stands. How did he even get to the point where he could use such an Awakening ability in the first place? So then I bring up the time Doflamingo showed that Awakening is the ability to use your Devil Fruit power externally outside of your body and even into other objects, such as the buildings around him. So then what I write is, what we can take away from seeing Doflamingo's use of Awakening is that 1, it puts into question whether or not a Devil Fruit is paramecia. Viz writes Paramethea. 2, that it allows the Devil Fruit use to extend their abilities outside of their body. Devil Fruit Awakening has never been just about granting power. Doflamingo doesn't simply just turn buildings into string. He can consciously control those strings. If a person learns to use Life Return, they are learning to have conscious control over their entire body. With Devil Fruit Awakening, it is as if the user is imposing an internal power outward through willpower. If Luffy was initially using Life Return to perform Culverin, then perhaps If Luffy was initially using Life Return to perform Culverin, then perhaps that was the gateway to him learning Awakening. Keep chasing him, Python. After him, Python. Notice how Luffy is seemingly giving his arm commands, as if it now has a will of its own. This is his version of Life Return. Through training himself to grant his arm a free will, he may have been also subconsciously learning how to give will to things outside of his body, thus effectively learning how to grant his Devil Fruit powers to his surroundings, aka Devil Fruit Awakening. What's interesting is that Kumo Dory, the person who is shown to be the best at Life Return in the series, refers to himself as a hermit of nature, and we know that Devil Fruit Awakening is the power to affect your environment, or if you have a zone Devil Fruit, it's like getting in touch with an animal, which is also still getting in touch with nature. And if you've watched Naruto, there's this ability called Sage Mode, Sage and a Hermit, pretty much the same thing. And in Sage Mode, you gather in power, and with that, you're able to affect your surroundings. It's sort of a similar concept. So with Kumadori being the poster boy of Life Return, you could almost see it as a hermit ability. I write, the term Awakening is heavily associated with spirituality, and the character most associated with Life Return is Kumadori. He is a self-proclaimed hermit. He and Luffy may seem unrelated to one another, but you can actually draw similarities between them. For starters, they are both associated with Shishi, or in other words, lion. Kumadori literally refers to himself as a lion, and Luffy's laugh is Shishishi. His ship is a lion, and Luffy has always been associated with the sun. Lions are frequently depicted as an animal that represents the sun, hence why the Thousand Sunny is a lion. Another similarity between the two is their choice of weapon. right? Obviously, Kumadori has a staff. You might think that Luffy hasn't been one to wield a weapon, besides swords, when he wasn't being serious. However, when he was younger, he wielded a pipe alongside his brothers, which is similar to a staff. Lastly, they both seem to have a Japanese inspiration in their abilities despite not being from Wano. You could argue that Luffy having a Japanese influence doesn't mean much since it is a Japanese story, but there are two things you should consider. Zoro seems to have a Japanese influence, but that makes sense because Oda stated that if Zoro was in the real world, he would be from Japan. On the other hand, Luffy would be from Brazil. Secondly, Hirogoro, a Wano native, took notice of Gear 4th and seemed to recognize the design. The reason I bring up the similarities is because I think Kumadori could have foreshadowed Luffy's power progression. Inhaling the wind, swallowing the mist. I find this interesting because Luffy's gears do seem to have to involve wind and mist. Being isolated from human civilization is what it means to live as a hermit, and Kumadori replies that is what was required of him to learn and master life return. And interestingly enough, that was a big part of how Rayleigh trained Luffy. The fact that the term awakening is used towards a devil fruit implies that something is dormant. I don't think the word awakening refers to just the devil fruit user, but the fruit itself as well. To be more specific, the spirit that was once in the fruit and now in the body of the new user. The name Life Return is a reference to biofeedback, but if you take the name literally, it's as if life is being returned, life brought back. Kind of like if the dead came back to life. Death can be seen as a form of sleep. To come back to life is an awakening. That is super relevant. I wrote this before chapter 1044 came out, where it was almost seemed like Luffy was dead and came back to life. But yeah, that's my reasoning for why I believe Life Return is relevant to the awakening of Luffy and Lucci. One thing I want to point out is Kaido's reaction to Luffy's arm bending, which is super weird because Kaido should definitely have decades of world experience and should have met many Roku Shiki users over that time. In fact, Who's Who is in his crew and has a Roku Shiki. So the fact that he was surprised that Luffy's arm can bend like that doesn't really make sense. Especially when you factor in he himself copied Luffy when he used his stealthy drunk or whatever it was called. Now, there's two things to factor in. One, even though he was copying the bending of Luffy, maybe he wasn't necessarily copying the acceleration, which you need rubber powers to do that. And two, if he somehow did copy that, I think it has to do with the fact that he's a dragon, and I think dragons were the ones who originally come up with the powers devil fruits are based off of. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed that. Not a new theory, but is new to YouTube at least. And look forward to my next theory, which is gonna be so detailed, so good. You're truly gonna understand Zone Devil Fruit Awakenings and Devil Fruit Awakenings in general, because I'm gonna come with so many receipts, so much evidence to show this is why this is this way, this is why that is that way. I'm talking super vague on purpose, but you'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for tuning in.